Hello and welcome to this NET English poetry talk through for the AQA Power and Conflict Anthology. Now today I'm going to be walking you through the context and the content for The Prelude. Let's start with a quick reading of the poem. So, The Prelude. One summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. Straight, I unloosed her chain, and stepping in, pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on, leaving behind her still on either side small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. But now, like one who rows, proud of his skill, to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the horizon's utmost boundary. Far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily, I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. When from behind that craggy steep, till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own, and measured motion like a living thing strode after me. With trembling oars I turned, through the silent water, stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. There in her mooring place I left my bark, and through the meadows homeward went, in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle, for many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. O'er my thoughts there hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, moved slowly through the mind by day, and were a trouble to my dreams. Now, William Wordsworth, who lived from 1770 to 1850, is probably the most famous of the Romantic poets, and is often viewed as one of the founding fathers of Romanticism. Now, Wordsworth was born and raised in the Lake District, and the landscape of the area was a key influence on him personally and professionally. Both of Wordsworth's parents died while he was relatively young, and he spent much of his remaining childhood separated physically and emotionally from the remaining members of his family. It's noticeable that much of Wordsworth's early work focuses heavily on isolation, on endurance, on death, and on grief. Now, Wordsworth's political views changed somewhat throughout his life. As a young man, Wordsworth spent time in revolutionary France and was both sympathetic to and inspired by the republican ideals of France at the time. And a lot of his early work shows a sympathy for the poor and needy in society. It was this, at least partially, that led Wordsworth to adopt quite an accessible and conversational style in comparison to the poetry that had gone before. And that's what he described in his writing as the language really used by men. However, the horrors of the Reign of Terror in France and the outbreak of war between France and Britain led to Wordsworth's later disillusionment. And despite his early political radicalism, Wordsworth became very much an establishment figure in his later life, including serving as Poet Laureate from 1843 to 1850. Now, Wordsworth was devout and largely quite conventional in his religious views. He was loyal to the Church of England throughout his life. He did, however, see his views of nature, humanity, and religion as inextricably interwoven. He found God in both the natural world and the human mind. And there are strong suggestions, especially in his early work, of what we call pantheism, of identifying God with the universe, or of regarding the universe as the manifestation of God. Although Wordsworth found inspiration in the natural world, his focus was always on its ability to influence and to reflect human experience. And his poems often follow a movement from external description and or experience of a landscape to reflections on the workings of the human mind and imagination. Wordsworth once described poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and commented that poetry takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. However, that ignores the fact that his writing is deeply conceptual and also carefully crafted. Wordsworth famously, for example, would stamp up and down the path outside his house to work on the rhythms of the poems he was writing. And there are versions of some of his poems that he reviewed, edited, and polished throughout his professional life. And the Prelude is one of those. The Prelude is generally viewed as Wordsworth's masterpiece. It was originally intended to be a prologue to a poetic autobiography called The Recluse, although Wordsworth would never actually complete that longer work, despite publishing sections during his lifetime. Now, Wordsworth began what would become the Prelude in 1798, and he worked on it until his death in 1850, with the final version only published posthumously. Wordsworth's intention in the Prelude was to recount his interactions with nature and recount how those experiences shaped him as a writer. It makes sense with that in mind for the poem to be written from a first-person perspective. I mean, it's a recount of a personal experience and a reflection on the formation of the self, and also for it to be written in blank, that is, non-rhyming verse, and as an extended single narrative stanza, almost a dramatic monologue or an epic poem. Wordsworth wants his reader to have a sense of the continuous causal process of the narrative. The poem explores the formation of Wordsworth's mind and poetic imagination, with a particular focus on various physical journeys as metaphors for spiritual journeys. Now, this extract of the longer poem recounts a reasonably simple and largely self-enclosed story. Wordsworth, as a child, steals a boat and goes rowing on a lake at night. While rowing, a mountain peak looms over him. Scared, he returns the boat and then spends time afterwards troubled by the experience. Now, the poem begins on a summer evening, and that's linked metaphorically to the innocence, positivity, and naivety of an idealized childhood. And on that summer evening, the narrator discovers a little boat within a rocky cove. It's worth noting that the narrator describes himself as being led by her, with the implication being that it's nature herself that's led him to this point. It's also worth noting both the abdication of responsibility, he was, after all, led by her, and also the sense of empowerment, a little boat, and the privacy and secrecy involved here in terms of the rocky cove. It is possible within the frame of the poem to interpret this as the personified boat leading Wordsworth on, although that could change the overall interpretation. The immediate loosening of her chain, implied by straight, suggests a sense of spontaneity rather than a conscious and calculated act. This is an act of instinct and emotion rather than rationality and reason, but it's also presented as an act of liberation. I mean, it's a chain after all, or at least the transference, assumption and assertion of control and ownership. The narrator is clear in his understanding that what he's doing is morally questionable at best and has to be undertaken furtively. This is, after all, an act of stealth and troubled pleasure. However, the oxymoron here is key. The sense of secrecy and transgression is the source of being both troubled, he knows he shouldn't, and also of the pleasure, he's enjoying it. There are both literal and psychological reverberations. The voice of mountain echoes, Wordsworth calls it. It's a sound, but it's also the sense of a wider awareness of his actions, and a broader sense of consequence and judgment lying beyond his immediate consciousness. Now, the lake on which the narrator is rowing seems to represent the apparent openness and easy freedom he believes there to be, perhaps also with an implicit suggestion of the invisible complexity hidden beneath the apparently calm surface. The child's understanding is like the boat moving across the surface of the water, limited and superficial. The mountains, in contrast, link to the enormity, the scope, the scale, and the consequence of the adult world, and that's spiritually, socially, geographically, and so on. that the childish self-centeredness and the naive arrogance of the narrator prevent him from seeing. The experience of rowing the boat is, it seems, a positive one. There are small circles glittering idly and forming a track of sparkling light, with only the moon, the stars, and the grey sky for company. The small circles are, again, this self-enclosed image. The motif of light links, as ever, to the idea of positivity, but it's also about observation, about sight. The narrator's actions are hidden, he thinks, unseen by the world, self-enclosed once again, a moment of solitude, of independence and of privacy. However, these self-enclosed circles formed by the actions of his oars are also part of a wider track, the ongoing narrative, with the implication that the narrator sees a direction to his path, and thus, again, that tension between control, I'm doing it, and abdicated responsibility, the idea that it's not my fault. Again, notice the arrogant certainty of the voice. He's proud of his skill and aiming for a chosen point with an unswerving line, without any boundaries, without any limitations, without any imposed structures, just a grey sky. There's a growing awareness of direction constructed in the narrative voice here, in terms of the presumption of choice and control in having fixed his view, having dipped his oars, and the immediate response in which his boat went heaving through the water like a swan. It's further reinforced by the reference to the boat as an elfin, so small, delicate, possibly mischievous and or elf-like, and it being a pinnace, which is a small boat. The implication is that Wordsworth's narrator sees himself as being powerful, as dominant, and in control of the personified boat. And notice that the boat is given the pronoun she, with the implied gender dynamic also suggesting that the narrator is discovering the responsibility involved in adulthood, and by extension, perhaps, a sense of intimate relationships and the negativity of patriarchal authority, or what we would now call toxic masculinity. The apparent grace and beauty of the swan image is juxtaposed almost immediately with the craggy steep, just as both Wordsworth's narrator and the elfin pinnace are juxtaposed with the enormity and darkness of the huge peak, black and huge. There's a sense of ambition and aspiration linked to the delusions of power on the part of the narrator. It's the summit on which his view is fixed, the horizon's utmost boundary. And there's a clear misapprehension regarding the relative importance of the narrator to this point, enormous in his own view, and the power of nature as it's now appearing. The peak, notice, is huge, with the adjective repeated twice to reinforce the sense of imposing enormity. What seems to most disturb the narrator, though, is not simply the size, huge, the darkness, black, or even the suddenness of its appearance when it upreared its head. Instead, it's the impression of the personified peak as having voluntary power instinct. It's not a passive and fixed point, unlike the lake, but something with will, with control, and with independence, something over which the narrator has no power, with the caesura after head cutting off the line in the same way that the mountain's appearance disrupts the moment. There's a moment of competition, of conflict, when the narrator struck and struck again, literally rowing faster, but with a sense of violence. But it's impossible to halt the growing of the grim shape, to the point where it towered up between me and the stars. There's a trick of perspective here. The further you row, the more your perspective changes, hence the literal growth of the mountain. But also the sense that the mountain represents the enormity and intimidating complexity of the adult world, of which the narrator is becoming increasingly aware. And that's hence that semantic field of daunting physical size, growing stature and towered. There does seem to be the strong implication that the mountain represents punishment or consequence, potentially even some sort of castigating father figure, but also that it becomes a barrier to the positivity and clarity that the narrator had earlier perceived there as being. Now, a popular and possibly linked reading of the poem is that the mountain represents the power of nature, and that this is being consciously reasserted after the naive arrogance of the child seemed to challenge it. The impact on the narrator is clear. We've moved from him having lustily dipped my oars and asserting that he rose upon the stroke earlier in the poem, to him now trembling and having turned so that he could steal my way back to the covert of the willow tree. And notice the shift to a semantic field of hiddenness, of secrecy, and potentially of shame. Silent, stole, covert. The boat's returned. The narrator makes his way homeward, but there's no possibility of returning to who he was and the worldview he had at the beginning of the poem. Instead, he's troubled by a grave and serious mood that lasts and becomes a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. There's been a shift in the narrator's view of the world from clarity and certainty to something dim, undetermined, and unknown. And this isn't simply about the world, but about himself. It's about how his brain worked, about modes of being, about thoughts. Rather than being one with the world and following a self-determined or determined path led by her one track of sparkling light, there's now darkness, a sense of solitude and of blank desertion. Even more, the world that he thought he knew hasn't simply been changed, but has been lost completely. No familiar shapes remained, he says. And that loss is of the sense of oneness and of ownership of the world, the pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, the colours of green fields. Instead, those images have been replaced, displaced by huge and mighty forms, the echoing influence of his experience of the mountain and his growing understanding of the world. It takes time for him to process these, to adapt his thinking and understanding, which is why they moved slowly through the mind by day, but were also a trouble to my dreams, with reference to both night and day, showing how all-encompassing the impact of the experience has been. The dreams here are clearly nightmares, but there's also a sense of a shift in his ambition, of his hopes. Phrased another way, we can see the physical journey that the narrator follows, also representing a metaphorical journey, from the naivety, from shallow arrogance, and the simplistic arrogance and ignorance of childhood, to the troubling complexity of adulthood and its impact on the narrator's ways of thinking, of imagining, and of understanding. In terms of building comparisons within the AQA Anthology, the focus on the power of nature and the tension it has with the power of humanity could link easily to something like, say, Storm on the Island, to Exposure, or to Ozymandias. However, there's also the link to childhood experiences, such as with the Emigre or Kamikaze, or equally to the idea of action and consequence in poems such as, again, Kamikaze, to Remains, or even to something like War Photographer. Thank you very much for listening, and don't forget that the whole range of English topics for GCSE are copied, including the Power and Conflict poetry, but obviously all the other texts and topics as well. And you can find those on the NET English YouTube channel, which is www.youtube.com/NET English 1.